On January 26, 1818, Dirk DenHartog was born to Hyman and Ida DenHartog in Haem-Boykop, the Netherlands. In 1817, John Baker was born to Walter and Neeltje Baker in Leerdam, the Netherlands. On February 1st, 1843, Dirk and John married in Leerbroek, the Netherlands. This is an image of the church they likely married in. On December 19, 1843, they gave birth to their first child, Neeltje. It is unknown why Dirk and John decided to leave the Netherlands and all they had ever known behind. However, there are at least two potential reasons that we know of. In 1834, H.P. Schulte and many other ministers and congregations seceded from the state church. They believed that everyone should have the freedom to worship as they pleased, and they should have equal protection under the law. King William didn't listen to their pleas to accept their new denomination as legal. Schulte continued to preach in spite of persecution and violence. His congregation grew, and many people were jailed, including Schulte, for worshiping without permission from the king. Sometimes Schulte preached in farm fields, and sometimes on a ship surrounded by small boats filled with eager listeners. In 1845, a potato blight broke out in the Netherlands, causing a shortage of food to eat. The poor and middle-class families had to eat food usually reserved for the animals. In 1846 and 1847, this food shortage became worse, and many people decided to leave their homeland. Regardless of the exact reason for leaving, saying goodbye to friends and relatives was a difficult experience. The immigrants realized they would never again see many of the people who had been so close to them in the Netherlands. Another difficulty they faced was they needed to take equipment for making cheese, butter, farm tools, and cooking utensils. Food for the long journey was also a major concern. They were advised to take cured meats, rice, flour, potatoes, peas, dried breads, butter, sugar, and anything that could be eaten without cooking. Home remedies were included since only one doctor was along on the voyage. In early April 1847, Dirk, John and Neeltje arrived in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, to leave for the United States in the promise of a better life. Somewhere between 800 and 900 immigrants traveled on 4 different ships. Dirk and his family took the voyage on the ship Masterum. Here is an image of this ship. On their way to America, 2 adults and 8 children died, mostly due to a violent storm. 6 babies were also born en route. On June 2nd, 1847, Dirk, John Neeltje, and the other Dutch immigrants arrived in Baltimore, Maryland. They passed through inspection quickly as the ships they were on were kept exceptionally clean. Once in America, the immigrants began their journey by train and canal boat. They navigated through the Allegheny Mountains and took steamboats on the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, where they took steamboats to St. Louis, Missouri. While most of the colony settled temporarily in St. Louis, a small group led by H.P. Schulte set out to find a suitable place for settlement. In Fairfield, Iowa, the group met Reverend Moses Post, a Baptist minister who suggested an area between the Skunk and the Des Moines Rivers in Marion County. The land still belonged to the government, but several American settlers had already claimed the land. The group was able to purchase 18,000 acres of fertile farmland for about $1.25 an acre. The committee instructed a few Americans to build 50 log cabins before the Dutch settlers arrived. They returned to St. Louis anxious to tell the other colonists about their new home, Pella. The trek from St. Louis began with a steamboat trip to Keokuk, Iowa, and proceeded on the Old Dragoon Trail. Travel was made by wagon, horse, or on foot. Late in the afternoon of August 26, 1847, the colonists arrived in what was to become Pella, Iowa. The 50 cabins had not been built as promised, although lumber was stacked for the purpose of building. Dugouts were the immediate solution to the housing problem. Temporary shelter never intended for permanence, although some were occupied for several years. Most of the dugouts in Pella were the half-dugout type, built partly above ground and partly dug into the soil, and walled with sod or saplings. Some dugouts could be built into existing hillsides. These were called broken country dugouts. Both types were roofed with prairie grasses spread over a woven network of branches from young riverbank saplings. This area became known as Strawtown. Primitive log cabins sheltered other settlers until more refined cabins, or framed houses, could be constructed. The Schultes moved into a crude cabin purchased from Thomas Tuttle, located on what is now the town square, Central Park. In total, 64 lots were surveyed for the new town. The Americans who stayed helped the Dutch settlers. Soon, other colonists from the Netherlands came and Pella prospered. This is the location of the home of H.P. Schulte. Construction on the home began in 1847 and was completed in 1848. It is believed that Dirk worked as a farmer for Schulte, as did Nicholas Earp, the father of the famous Wyatt Earp, who grew up in Pella. It is reasonable to think that our ancestors at the very least knew Wyatt Earp when he was younger. In 1848, Dirk and Janche gave birth to their second child, Ida. On July 17, 1850, they gave birth to their third child, John. This is an image of a census from 1850 for the Lake Prairie Township in Marion County, Iowa, which includes Dirk, Janche, and their children Neelche, Ida, and John, who had been born only 2 weeks before this census was completed. Sadly, on September 12, 1851, at the age of 34, Dirk DenHartog drowned in the Des Moines River. It is of course unknown exactly where this tragedy occurred. This left Janche as a single mother, raising 3 young kids in a newly founded, potentially dangerous and uncertain place to live, yet she and the young kids persevered. In 1853, Janche remarried to Dingaman DeHaan in Pella, Iowa. It is unclear where exactly the original DenHartog farm was located prior to Dirk's drowning. However, it would make sense to have this farm close to the newly established town of Pella. This is an image of a plat map from the area in 1860. As you may or may not be able to see, there are a number of farms listed as DenHartog. One in particular, though, is on the southwest edge of Pella. This may have been the location or near the location of the original DenHartog farm, but at this time it is unknown. On September 18, 1872, John DenHartog, son of Dirk DenHartog, married Annig J. Veerhoff in Marion County, Iowa. Between 1873 and 1875, John and Annig J. had 3 children, Mike in 1873, Jonig J. in 1874, and Johanna in 1875. In 1875, John and Annig J. and their 3 children moved to a farm in Sioux County, Iowa. Between 1876 and 1897, they had 10 more children. Dirk in 1877, Hyman in 1878, Neeltje in 1880, Gertrude in 1881, Dingaman in 1883, John Jr. in 1887, Adrian in 1889, Ida in 1890, Walter in 1894, and Edward in 1897. This is a family image from the 1890s of John and Annig J. and their 13 children. On the far left of the image in the middle row is Adrian DenHartog as a boy around the age of 10. He was the father, grandfather, and great-grandfather of many current family members, including the father of Robert DenHartog. Adrian went by the name of James throughout much of his life. On August 7, 1901, John's wife Annig J. passed away at the age of 49, only 4 days short of her 50th birthday. On April 26, 1922, John DenHartog passed away after a 5-year battle with Bright's disease at the age of 71. John, Annig J., and several DenHartog family members have their final resting place at the West Lawn Cemetery in Orange City, Iowa.
There seemed to be nothing to see. No fences, no creeks or trees. No hills or fields. There was nothing but land. Not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. Willa Cather.
It is believed that humans first moved into the tallgrass prairie region about 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers of the last ice age were retreating north. They developed their own languages and cultures. Some became farmers. Others were nomadic, relying on the abundant game, especially the bison, for their food. And all of them learned to use fire to manipulate the environment for their own benefit. They deliberately burned parts of the prairie landscape in order to plant crops, to control animal movement while hunting, to encourage the growth of fresh grass that would attract bison and elk, even to create blackened campsites as safe havens from the frequent wildfires. Their use of fire was so extensive that it altered the landscape, Native American burning expanded and maintained the eastern portion of the tallgrass prairie and checked the spread of forest vegetation. Eventually, at least 30 tribes called the tallgrass prairie home. The Lakota and the Kiowa, the Iowa, the Missouri, and the Kansa, the Omaha, the Ojibwe, and the Sac and Fox.
It's really important to stress that there's a lot of diversity within this region. You have groups, for example, like the Ojibwe and the Dakota, who are immediate neighbors, but have languages that are literally as different as Chinese and English. You have groups like the Dakota, which have a language which is highly gendered. There are different ways that men speak and that women speak. So too do you have dramatic differences in culture. There are certain things about the landscape of the tallgrass prairie region that tied all Native people who lived there together, and certain ways in which the land would dictate livelihoods.
The Iowa had always been comfortable with the prairie. They knew the various plants. They knew the various features, how the wind would move across the grass would tell what direction they were in. When they would look at certain plants, such as the compass plant, they could tell what direction they needed to move in.
This was land where people farmed extensively, especially in the eastern part of the tallgrass prairie region, farming predominantly corn, but other vegetables as well.
For the most part, Native people lived in relative harmony with the tallgrass prairie. According to their religious beliefs, the earth was alive and nature was a divine order that was to be respected. Plants and animals were often seen as brotherly manifestations of the Great Spirit. Killing them was done carefully and ritualistically. They understood the rhythms of the landscape, the ebb and flow of life on the prairie. But they were practical people whose lives have too often been mythologized, creating a false and misleading caricature, the ecological Indian. For hundreds of generations, Native Americans had the tall grass to themselves. But in the late 1600s, that began to change.
My great-grandfather, Nanamaki, was told in a dream by the Great Spirit that he should see a white man. Nanamaki went alone and found that a white man had arrived and pitched his tent. The white man took him by the hand and told him that he was the son of the King of France, that he too had been dreaming, that the Great Spirit had directed him to come here, where he should meet a nation of people who had never seen a white man, and that they should be his children, and he should be their father. Black Hawk.
In 1673, a Jesuit priest named Jacques Marquette, a fur trader named Louis Joliet, and a party of 5 men traveling in 2 bark canoes began exploring the upper reaches of the Mississippi River. Like all other white people of the time, they believed that the eastern forests extended all the way across North America. And when Indians told them about the prairies they would soon encounter, Marquette and Joliet discounted the stories as tall tales. Then they entered the tall grass. For the next century and a quarter, France, Spain, and England each laid claim to different parts of the tallgrass prairie, and each sent representatives to trade with Native Americans. Then at the start of the 19th century, a newly formed nation on the Atlantic seaboard turned its eyes westward. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson agreed to purchase the vast Louisiana territory from Napoleon I of France. For $15 million, Jefferson doubled the size of the United States and brought most of the tallgrass prairie within the boundaries of his young nation. At the same time, Jefferson also dispatched the explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition was expected to map the recently acquired lands, catalog the plant and animal life, and establish trade relations with Native Americans. Jefferson also hoped that this new landscape would be a place where sturdy yeoman farmers, his ideal Americans, would be able to thrive. In the early summer of 1804, Lewis and Clark entered the heart of the tallgrass prairie. Like everyone else before them, they were overwhelmed by what they saw.
One day, William Clark was out hunting an elk in 1804. It led him out of the trench of the Missouri where it's heavily wooded, and he came across this prospect he wrote in his diary that he said was a boundless prairie. He said boundless because the grass was 2 feet high and it stretched as far as he could see. And he said that the sight was so sudden and entertaining, in his words, that I briefly forgot the object of my mission, that is, to find that elk. Now, William Clark is not a guy who's likely to forget the object of his mission. Meriwether Lewis wrote back to his mother that this river of the Missouri waters one of the fairest portions of the globe, nor do I believe there is in the universe a similar extent of country. I always like to think he's talking about Iowa in that line. Nebraskans might think otherwise. But they all saw, I think, in the tall grass prairie, not just the captains, but the members of the expedition, all mentioned about how beautiful the prairie was. But they all had farming roots themselves, and they could see, fertile soil and tell it when they saw it, and they knew that this was the real deal.
My reason teaches me that land cannot be sold. The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon. So long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have the right to the soil. Nothing can be sold but such things as can be carried away. Black Hawk.
The Ojibwe word to sort of own something or have possession of a piece of land, it really doesn't have that meaning at all. When you say denhartog aki, when the land is owned, or odebendan aki, he owns a piece of land, it doesn't have that same meaning. It means more to measure something in your mind. What is the relationship someone has with that thing or that piece of land or whatever it happens to be? For Ojibwe people, the relationship to land was really important. It wasn't just about feeding families. There were sacred places way out on the prairies, places of great significance. You have Pipestone, Minnesota, being a place where most of the tribes in the entire region, from as far south as Texas to, as far west as Montana, and as far east as Pennsylvania, end up traveling for the purpose of harvesting catlinite for the manufacture of ceremonial prayer pipes.
I think sometimes that the differences between how European cultures viewed land and how Indians saw it can sometimes get stereotyped and oversimplified. People, regardless of their culture, respond to landscape. And people, regardless of their culture, see in land opportunity and exploit it.
The Americans moving west brought with them views of nature and the land heavily influenced by the European philosophers Francis Bacon and John Locke. Bacon argued that nature was hostile, evil, and chaotic, and that it was a moral imperative for civilized societies to conquer and subdue nature in order to understand its secrets. Locke believed that the value of land was derived from labor required to improve it, and the benefits that resulted from this labor. He considered wilderness, or uncultivated land, synonymous with waste. The flood of white settlement first pushed into the eastern edge of the tallgrass prairie after the War of 1812, when the federal government initiated a series of peace and friendship treaties, that in reality steadily dispossessed Native Americans of their land. By 1821, these treaties had created the fault lines upon which a major conflict would emerge some years later, a conflict that would radically alter the lives of thousands of Native Americans and forever change the landscape they called home. One of the treaties called for the Sac and Fox to abandon their ancestral villages and fertile fields along the Rock River in Illinois and move west across the Mississippi River. A tribal elder and respected war chief named Black Hawk believed that the treaty allowed the Sac and Fox the right to farm their lands in the east and to live in their seasonal ancestral villages as they had for hundreds of years. In April of 1832, Black Hawk and his son Whirling Thunder led a large group of followers back across the Mississippi River to plant corn in their fields along the Rock River in what is now the state of Illinois.
They had been across the river perhaps maybe even just a couple of hours, not very long at all, and some settlers had spied them and reported them to the militia, and the militia came riding up. Black Hawk had sent out riders with a white flag of truce to tell them, we're just here to plant corn. And they were fired upon by the militia, and the Black Hawk War started.
Relentlessly pursued across Illinois and Wisconsin, Black Hawk would prove to be a brilliant military strategist. He and his followers engaged in a successful guerrilla campaign that lasted for months. Finally, Black Hawk and his followers found themselves surrounded by American soldiers and, ironically, their Dakota allies at the confluence of the Mississippi and Bad Axe rivers in what is now the state of Wisconsin. As he attempted to rally his warriors, Black Hawk instructed the others to swim across the Mississippi to safety. But many of them drowned. And those who made it across were killed by the Dakota. Hundreds of the Sac and Fox died. Somehow, Black Hawk and a small group of about 40 followers escaped, and for a time found refuge in other native communities. But eventually, to save the lives of his people, he surrendered to the United States government and signed the Black Hawk Treaty of 1832, the first of many native land cessions that would clear the way for white settlers on the tall grass.
A lot of people have painted the Black Hawk War as sort of a pivotal, seminal event in the history of opening up the tall grass prairie region to white settlement, and it was more than most any event except for America gaining its own independence. This would open the way.
When they landed on our territory, the white men were received as long-absent brothers, whom the Great Spirit had returned to us. Food and rest were freely given them by our fathers, and yet, from the day when the pale-faces landed upon our shores, they have been robbing us of our inheritance, and slowly, but surely, driving us back towards the setting sun. Black Hawk.
There are moments in history where great tragedy can occur, where hope is colliding with hope, where the purposes and the plans of the native peoples who had lived there collided with the individual hopes of white settlers whose basic business was hoping to do something better for their families. There's a long history of that in the United States, and there certainly is quite a few people whose opinion of Indians at that time was certainly debasing and racist. But on the whole, for many of them, they were coming out to try to make things a little bit better for the succeeding generations. And therein lies both the tragedy on the one hand, and who we are on the other.
While there is some uncertainty to the exact meaning of our last name, there is at least one source that states the meaning as follows. While obviously there is no way to know for sure, it is believed that the DenHartogs are the descendants of the Lords of Arkell, which ruled a large area in the southern Netherlands for more than 200 years. If true, this would explain the supposed meaning of our last name. In approximately 1220 AD, John van Arkell I was born to Herberen in Alverade van der Leed. It is believed that he was the original Lord of Arkell. Present-day towns in the territory included Leerdam, Arkell, Heukelum, Asperen, Hagestein, Astricht, and Gorinchem. Between 1247 and 1267, the soon-to-be town of Gorinchem and the surrounding area became the property of the Lords of Arkell. In 1267, the Lords of Arkell began to build a large castle on the east side of Gorinchem. While the Lords of Arkell had several castles, the castle in Gorinchem was the main castle that they lived in. In 1412, Gorinchem fell into the hands of Count William VI. In 1417, William van Arkell tried to get Gorinchem back. He and his troops succeeded in getting into the town, but during fierce fighting in the streets, William van Arkell was killed. This ended the period of the Lords of Arkell.